Now that we know that it's not so simple just to change your pledge, even if you intend to upgrade your pledge, we have to ask ourselves, what does this teach us in life? Besides the obvious, which is that you should keep your word, and the not so obvious, which is that if you pledge something to the shul, you are very welcome to increase it. So besides that, what else could we learn from this story? To come to shul, exactly. So we learned that there are two kinds of pledge, two categories of pledge. There's what's called nidrei isur, where a person pledges to not do something, but the technical nature of it is basically to say, this thing is forbidden for me. So that's like the individual who says that for them, chocolate is like treif, because they want to diet. Now that's not necessarily a good reason to make such a neder, and the truth is, they were discouraged from making that kind of a neder. It's not a healthy thing to take what the Torah allows you to have and decide that you're going to forbid it to yourself. Not ideal. Then we said the other kind of promise pledge that a person undertakes is nidrei hekdesh, where a person wants to take an ordinary item and sanctify it, which is where you take an animal and you turn it into a sacrifice. So you've made it holy, you've sanctified it. And by extension, when you take money and you pledge that money to a holy cause, it's not just that you're funding that cause, but you've actually made the money holy. So those are the two kinds of neder, of pledge that we've explored. But now we're going to be a little bit more specific, because this idea of nidrei hekdesh, of me making a pledge, and the nature of that pledge is that I'm dedicating something to hekdesh, to a holy cause, is in its most specific form what we call a sacrifice, right? That's what we're learning about in our parasha. Our parasha is we're learning about sacrifices. What's
so
the
I have a real humble question. You take an animal as a sacrifice, and you're making him holy, and his reward, he gets his neck cut.
That's how you make it holy.
So what's that, al kiddush Hashem?
Well, basically, if you think of it this way, an animal obviously is a physical entity, like any other physical entity. And specifically, it's not just a physical entity, but it's a very base entity, which means its entire life is very simply about physical things: survival, procreation, eating. When a person takes an item and converts that item into something which is holy, it's no longer part of this base physical world. So if I have money, it's very simple. All I've got to do is take the money and move it from my possession into the possession of the shul, or the whatever it is, whichever the particular holy cause is that I'm donating to. I don't have to do anything radical to change it. Whereas when I bring an animal as a sacrifice, two radical things happen. First is that we slaughter it. The Hebrew word for that is shchita. Now the halacha tells us, ein v'shochat ela u'moshach, which means that in order to have a kosher shchita, there's a very specific method that you have to follow, and part of that method is that it has to be mashicha. Mashicha means that you draw the knife across the neck of the animal. You can't stab the animal, you can't chop the animal, you can't saw the animal, and that's why the knife has to be so sharp. Chassidus explains that halacha with a spiritual perspective. Ein v'shochat, there's no interpretation of the word to slaughter as opposed to kill, ela u'moshach, except for the meaning of the word mashicha. Mashicha is a word, firstly it's a verb, and secondly it's a verb with that halachic connotation, but the verb means to draw. So for example, you might want to take something that's floating in the water, might want to salvage it and pull it out of the water. So you'll say that you mashicha, you moishech, you're pulling it out of the water. And in the same way, halachically, let's say that I want to sell you my animal. So normal things that I sell you, I put them in your hands, right? I want to sell you a product. I give you the product, you hold it in your hand, now we know that it's yours. It's not very likely that you're going to pick up, say, for example, a cow. So how do you acquire it? Moshach. You have to pull it by its reins, and that moves it from one domain to another domain. So in v'shachat elo moshach. The meaning of shchita is not God forbid that we have the right just to kill a creature. But the idea is moshach, that you're trying to pull it into something which is a different reality. Okay? Now you're going to say, that's all very nice, that sounds great, theoretically, because you're not the animal, it's getting shechted. Okay? So then you come to the next point, which is you take this animal and you put it on an altar and you burn it. Part of it is eaten, except for the oila offering. Part of the animal is eaten, but the main part of the korban is that it's put onto an altar and it is burnt in fire. And we know that out of all physical elements, fire is the only one that defies gravity. And that's why it's a symbol of the soul. That's why when a person, for example, has a yahrzeit, you light a candle. Because King Solomon tells us, Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam, that the neshama is like a candle. It's like a flame. And the reason it's like a flame is because the nature of a soul is that it wants to escape the physical and it wants to be able to have an opportunity to connect to Hashem. In the same way as fire is always tugging upwards, always pulling upwards. So what we want to do is we want to take that and we want to put it into the fire. The implication is that obviously the fire is not going to do anything spiritual to the animal, but it's symbolic of what we've done. Because we've now involved this animal in a spiritual ritual, and we believe that every single thing has some kind of a soul inside it. Of course, it doesn't have the same soul as we have, but it has some kind of a soul inside of it. So what we've done now is we've elevated the spiritual component of this animal, which you would call the soul, we've elevated it now to another dimension by dedicating it in a process of serving Hashem. So that's the idea of a sacrifice. If you just willy-nilly, that's why you're not allowed to, for example, go hunting. You can't just kill animals for sport. There has to be, like anything else, by the way, you can't just, as a Jewish person, engage in the world just stum. There's always got to be some kind of a higher intention and some kind of an investment in trying to transform and elevate things. Okay, so that's the idea of a sacrifice. So what do we call a sacrifice in Hebrew? That's one type of a sacrifice. Right? Oila is one type. But if I take a korban, I call it a sacrifice, I call it a korban. Korban is from the root korev, which means to come close or to bring close. Okay? So you look at the beginning, the opening line of this week's parasha, and it says, Adam ki yakriv mikem korban Hashem. When a person will bring from you a sacrifice to Hashem. Which implies, because the grammar there is not exactly the way you'd expect it. You would expect, and then it goes on to say, that you're going to bring an animal either from cattle or from sheep. It should have said, grammatically, it should have said, Adam mikem, a person from amongst you, ki yakriv korban Hashem, who now wants to bring a sacrifice to Hashem. Instead, what does the Torah say? Adam ki yakriv mikem, a person who wants to bring from you a sacrifice to Hashem. It's unusual grammar. And so it implies that the goal is not simply to take an animal and schlep it to the Beis Hamikdash and put it onto an altar. It implies that the objective is that you want to bring yourself closer to Hashem. That's what a korban is. It's from the word korov or korev, which means to come close. That's why the Ramban, not to be confused with the Rambam, right? The Ramban, Nachmanides, says that when you brought a korban, you had to stand there and watch the process. Now, if you're a little bit of a squeamish person, that's not going to be great. Right? Anybody who's been to Kapporos will know it's not so simple to watch the process. But you had to. You had to watch the process. That's the law. So the Ramban comments, why do you have to watch the process? Surely it's good enough. You brought the animal. You did what you had to do. You had all the intentions. The Kohen does his job. Why do you have to watch the whole thing? It says because you have to stand there thinking, that should be me. Based on the way I've lived my life. Maybe I deserve to, God forbid. Now, that sounds very negative, right? That sounds very harsh. Very harsh. Especially when you consider that you didn't just bring a korban once in your life. There were korbanos on a regular basis.
Sorry, Rabbi. Please forgive me. A person brought the korban, the animal, whatever, or whatever, and did they give it to the Kohen who slaughtered?
They gave it to the Kohen, although technically you could slaughter your own animal. There was a little bit of a tricky method to be able to do it because you're only allowed to enter certain areas of the Beis Hamikdash. But typically, you could, halachically, you could slaughter your own animal. It was after the animal was slaughtered, then it had to for sure be in the hands of the Kohen. Every other part of the process could only be done by Kohen. So it sounds very harsh, right? Sounds very harsh. Now, the first of all of the sacrifices that we're taught about is the Oila sacrifice. The Oila sacrifice is something which was called Kolil. Kolil means that the entire thing had to be burnt on the altar, as opposed to other sacrifices where the Kohanim would get a piece of the meat, and in the Shlomim sacrifice where the Kohanim and the person who brought the sacrifice would get a piece of the meat. But the Oila offering is Kolil. It has to be completely consumed. Completely consumed. So now we're going to take a deeper perspective on what the Ramban is telling us. He's not saying this is some kind of a morbid fascination with the fact that maybe I've been bad and therefore I deserve, chas v'shalom. You're supposed to look at the sacrifice and you say, that should be me. I should be Kalil. I should be completely consumed by dedication to Hashem. Just like this animal is going to be completely consumed. There'll be nothing left. My dedication to Hashem should be absolute, without any, so to speak, leftovers. Meaning to say, there should be no part of me that's focused on something else. I should be completely focused on Hashem. That's the idea behind bringing a korban. This korban is now being burnt up in the fire of the altar. I should be burnt up in the passion of serving Hashem, that I'm so dedicated, I'm so passionate, that there's no space left for anything else. That's how you're supposed to look at a korban. So therefore, what is the message of a korban? That a person should be dedicated 100% to Hashem. That then distinguishes a korban from every other mitzvah. Because every other mitzvah is about a very specific point of contact between myself and Hashem. So in a couple of minutes we're going to put on tefillin, right? So what part of us is engaged with Hashem when we put on tefillin? Our head and our arm. And only one of the arms. But that's what tefillin is designed for. To create a point of contact between my head and my arm and Hashem. And let's say before I put on tefillin, I'm going to put on a talis. So what's the talis going to engage? It's going to engage my shoulders and my back. And if I wear the talis over my head, we'll also engage my head with Hashem. And then later today, or even before davening for that matter actually, before davening I'm supposed to give some tzedakah. So what's that going to affect? It's going to affect my hand that's putting the tzedakah in, and it's going to be a point of contact between my income and Hashem. So it's not only about my person, it's actually about my assets as well. And so it goes. And that's why we're told that there are 613 mitzvahs, because there are 613 components to human anatomy. And the idea is that each mitzvah is supposed to link part of us to Hashem. But each individual mitzvah is not designed to create an overall kolil, all-in dedication to Hashem. That's what a korban is for. A korban is supposed to represent that you're all in. So therefore, when a person makes a pledge, what we've described as nidrei isur, I'm saying that this specific item, which the Torah allows me to have, I am choosing to say that in my life that's going to be as good as treif. That's what a neder is, right? Or this activity that the Torah says I'm permitted to do, I'm going to say, I'm making a pledge that this activity now is forbidden for me. So how much of myself links up to Hashem because of that pledge? Whatever that part of my life is. So the person who says, I want to become a Nazir, which is a pledge, it's a neder. And the implication of that Nazirus is that I'm never allowed to have a grape product. That means anything associated with grapes and wine and raisins, whatever, that is a point of contact between me and Hashem. That's where it starts, that's where it ends. And that's why we say exactly the words that you use, those are the words that we have to consider. Because what you're doing is, you're making a very specific deal with Hashem. So the specific deal has to fit your words. But when you want to bring a korban, what are you trying to do? You're trying to throw yourself all in, right? That's what you're trying to do. It's a korban. You're trying to say, I'm here, I'm passionate, I'm dedicated, I'm ready to do whatever Hashem wants. So in that case we say, all right, if the words that you chose to use are limiting words, I'm going to bring a calf. And now on the day of the offering, you decide, I want to do more than that. I want to bring a bull. We say Gesundheit hate. The whole psychology of a korban was that you were going to be all in, that you were kolil, that you were completely dedicated. So that left open your intention. The moment you said korban, your intention was to do the max for Hashem. So your words limited it to a calf. Big deal. We're not going to make you stuck in your words because your intention was, I'm in. I'm completely dedicated to Hashem. Therefore, if afterwards you want to change your pledge and increase it, we welcome that with open arms. That's exactly what the theme of a korban is, to give as best, as much, and as passionately as you can. So that then gives us a very powerful lesson. Because go back, so we started this whole thing with this debate. We had the Rambam's view, and it's based on the Mishnah, which has the debate between Rebbe and the Rabbanan. And we even analyzed that the Rambam's language doesn't seem to suit what he's trying to say, which we've kind of looked at. Let's go back to the Rambam's language. What does he say? Hanoi der koton, if a person pledges a small pledge, meaning a younger, juvenile animal, vehevi godol, and instead on the day he brought a larger, more mature, and therefore more expensive animal, yotza, he's fulfilled his obligation. So at that point, the way we read the Rambam, it sounds like he's just telling us a fact, a legal fact. And if you upgrade your offering, great, that's good news. But implied in that is a lesson in life. Hamevi katan. What happens if somebody says, I need to draw closer to Hashem? I want to bring a korban, which basically means I want to improve my relationship with Hashem. I'm feeling a little bit disconnected. I'm feeling a little bit distant. I want to create a relationship with Hashem, or I want to improve my relationship with Hashem. But I don't know if I have the wherewithal. I don't know if I have the wisdom. I don't know if I have the time. So what am I going to pledge? Maybe cotton. Let me just do a little bit. And maybe I'm self-conscious because everybody's going to look at me and say, that's all you're going to do. Can't you come up with a little bit more dedication? Maybe cotton, the Torah is telling us, don't be afraid of coming forward with a little bit of dedication, with a small step in the right direction. You know why? Because, Hanoi der Katan, the person who pledges something small. You know what might happen? Maybe Godel. That will bring you to something bigger. Because we frequently get caught in the psychology that says, maybe what I'm doing is imperfect, maybe it's meaningless, maybe it's trivial, maybe I need to be really radical in my movements. And so what do? We say, maybe I shouldn't do anything. Because my little bit of input maybe isn't really worth very much. Says the Rambam, Hanoi der koton, or maybe Godel yotza. If you make a small pledge, you don't know how this is going to plan out. You don't know what it's going to turn into. It might turn into something radical. Don't delay doing something that you interpret to be minor, that is positive, because you feel that it's shemzach, that it's not big enough. There's an expression they use in English, which is, perfect is the enemy of good. Meaning, many of us, a lot of the time, paralyze ourselves when we have an opportunity to do something positive because we're afraid that we're not doing it correctly. And here the lesson is that you just start your katan, you just put in your little bit, and that will lead to other things. Like the Mishnah tells us, mitzvah goyreres mitzvah. One mitzvah pulls another mitzvah, pulls another mitzvah. And that most likely is why the Rebbe was so eager to have a mitzvah campaign. where essentially what you're doing is you say, you get a person to do one mitzvah. It's not your business to know what happens for the rest of their life. You encounter a Jewish person, you put on tefillin with them. That's their small contribution. In your eyes, maybe you'll think it was just a once-off encounter. You don't know. You don't know what that could lead to, inspire, impact. So maybe, I know that cotton or maybe godel. That's one thing you have to consider, is that sometimes your small pledge grows and matures into something which is much more significant. We see the same theme again in the sixth parasha in two ways. The first thing we see in the sixth parasha is that out of all of the sacrifices the Torah could describe, it starts by describing what is called a nadava, which is a voluntary sacrifice. Quite surprising, because there's so many mandated sacrifices. You would expect that the Torah first tells us what you have to do before it tells us what you could choose to do, don't you think? First tell me what I'm obligated to do, and then saying over and above that, if you want, you could add more. Why does the Torah start with a nadava, with something which is purely a donation, a voluntary donation? Why? Because a korban is, I am all in for Hashem. Where do you see that I am all in for Hashem? If I choose to do something. If I'm doing what I'm told, you don't know that I'm in. Maybe I'm just compliant. Maybe there's no fire in my belly. Maybe I'm not passionate. Maybe I'm just timid. I'm one of those people, I'm a yes man. You don't know that there's a fire. So where does the Torah start the conversation about sacrifices? Nadava. The first thing is the choices we make to do something because we want to do it. It doesn't have to be big. No der cotton. But it should be driven by what I want to do. I want to show enthusiasm. Second lesson is this. Second lesson is there are certain sacrifices that it depends on your personal circumstances. For example, the Torah tells us in this week's parasha that there are certain sacrifices you can bring as an animal or as a bird. If you bring it as a bird, the halacha is you don't pluck out the feathers before you put it on the altar. Rashi says, if you're going to burn a bird with the feathers, it's going to smell terrible. Why do you leave the feathers on? So he says, you know why? Because the person who brings a bird is obviously in a more difficult financial situation, and we don't want his sacrifice to look scrawny. So we leave the feathers on, so at least it looks a little bit more substantial. Then there's certain sacrifices where a person could be in an even lesser physical state, in other words, in a more difficult financial situation, where they can't even afford the bird. For certain sacrifices, they're then entitled to bring a mincha flour offering. When the Torah tells us about the mincha flour offering in this week's parasha, it says, "V'nefesh ki sakriv minchas," right? Mincha, whatever. That it says a soul that brings a mincha offering. It doesn't say a person; it says a soul. So Rashi says, why does it say a soul? Hashem says, because Maile ani. Hashem says, I consider it as if he brought his soul. What did the guy bring? A little pancake at the end of the day. I mean, that's what it is, a flour offering. It's nothing. Hashem says, this person, they couldn't afford more. This is what they could do, but they're doing it wholeheartedly. I consider it as if they brought their soul. Now that word, Maile ani olav, I don't know if you can hear in it, you can hear the word ma'aleh actually means to elevate. So what's Hashem saying? You bring your flour, and I will elevate it, I will upgrade what you have done to consider it as if you brought your soul. Nadar cotton v'hevi gadol. If your pledge is a small pledge, don't worry. Maile ani. Hashem's going to help upgrade it.
Is the spelling of that the same as malay in Hebrew?
No.
Because that's also nice.
Yeah, but it's a different root, root word. So what's the take-home message from this story? The take-home message is that our motivation has to be korban. I need to connect myself to Hashem, not just in a specific area, not just checking boxes of things that I'm supposed to do. I've got to be all in. When I approach with an attitude of wanting to connect, even if my step is a small step, Hashem will give it impetus to turn it into something more powerful. And that's what we have to remember. Don't be ashamed to do something which appears in maybe your assessment of how other people will look at it as if it's something small. It doesn't matter. Go all in to do something small. The effects will be far greater than you could imagine.